In 66, the Jews were unanimous in their unwillingness to accept the tyranny of a foreign ruler. This unanimity, laced with a good deal of religious fanaticism, helped them drive the Roman invaders out of their country and repel the first attack. This was the end of what united all the participants of the revolt, as the leaders of the main parties had different programs for further action. Against the background of the aggravated among the rebels' party struggle and unwillingness to seek compromise, the Romans were preparing a new invasion of the rebellious province. Emperor Nero was informed about the rebellion in Judea during his travels in Greece. To suppress the unrest required an experienced military commander, and Nero's choice fell on Titus Flavius Vespasianus. He was an old military man who had extensive experience in command in Britain, and thanks to his brother Flavius Sabinus, who was the city prefect of Rome, Vespasian enjoyed authority in the Senate. Entrusting Vespasian command of a large army, Nero assumed that he would not pose a threat to him because of his ignorant origin and a soft name. As a sign of favor to the commander, the emperor allowed his eldest son Titus to accompany his father to the front as a legate. For a young man who had not yet held the office of praetor, such an appointment was extraordinary. In the early spring of 67, Vespasian set out from Greece for Syria. In addition to 15,000 legionaries, this army included 23 auxiliary cohorts, 6 cavalry as well as numerous detachments of troops of allied kings. In all, gathered in Ptolemy's Roman army numbered in its ranks more than 60,000 people. Jewish preparations. The victory at Beth Horon caused a surge of enthusiasm in the entire Jewish people. In the middle of November, a general assembly was held on the Temple Mount, at which a new government was brought to power. At its head was the high priest Anan ben Anan, who belonged to one of the noblest families in Jerusalem. In 62 AD he had already performed these duties, but was dismissed by order of the Roman procurator. Under the new circumstances, this contributed to the growth of his authority among the people. Other government posts were also occupied by aristocrats and priests belonging to the moderate party. Popular leaders who had risen to prominence during the hostilities were pushed out of power. Eleazar ben Ananias, the leader of the Zealots, was removed from Jerusalem on the pretext of being appointed military commander of Idumea. Another leader of the radical rebels, Simon Bar Giora, who had proved himself a skillful military leader during the battle with the forces of Cassius Gallus, was forced to seek refuge in the desert with his supporters. The most important duty of the government was to organize the defense of the country in anticipation of the inevitable invasion. To this end, it began to create a regular army out of unstructured groups of militia, whose soldiers were paid and armed with weapons captured in the arsenals. The country was divided into 8 districts, each of which was sent a commander. In military respect, the most important was Galilee, because it was here that the first enemy strike was to be expected. Galilee covered the ways of access to the southern regions of the country. Due to favorable geographical conditions here, it was possible to create strong fortifications and organize a serious resistance to the enemy's advance. Its defense was entrusted to Joseph ben Mattathias, a prominent member of the Jerusalem aristocracy. According to his own account, as commander he fortified the main cities of Galilee, and formed an army of 100,000 men. Having assembled an army at Ptolemy, Vespasian launched an offensive in Galilee. The beginning of the all-armed operation was preceded by the falling away from the rebellion of the city of Sepphoris, which appealed to the Roman commander with a request to send a garrison there. A detachment under the command of Placidus was sent to the aid of its inhabitants. Well-fortified Sepphoris, located deep behind the line of defense of the Jews, the Romans turned into an important strategic base. The soldiers stationed there made constant raids on the surrounding countryside, causing great harm to the local population. Joseph ben Mattathias's belated attempt to seize Sepphoris was easily repulsed. Joseph's main forces were assembled not far from Sepphoris. When a large Roman army appeared at the borders of Galilee, the Jews were so terrified that they simply scattered. Josephus retreated to Tiberias with his remaining forces. Here he wrote a letter to Jerusalem, describing what had happened and requesting further instructions. Meanwhile, scouts informed him that the Romans were marching on Jotapata, 9 kilometers north of Sepphoris. Because of its location on the northwestern edge of Lower Galilee, Jotapata blocked the enemy's way inland. The city was fortified by Josephus and had a strong garrison, which successfully repulsed the first attempted attack. While the Romans had not yet managed to completely encircle Jotapata, Josephus and his detachment penetrated its walls to personally lead the defense. A few days later, Vespasian approached Iotapata with the main forces, after which the city was cordoned off by 3 lines of outposts and completely blockaded. On the eve of the siege, Iotapata had large supplies of food, but no source of water. Therefore, the besieged had to draw water from cisterns of natural and artificial origin. Josephus estimated the total population of the city, including soldiers and refugees, at 40,000, which is certainly an exaggeration. The siege of the city began in June. Fierce fighting broke out in front of the city walls. Lack of military equipment and training, the Jews compensated for a stronger position and high morale. After 5 days of battles, it became clear to Vespasian that it was impossible to take the city by direct attack, and he gave the order to prepare for a systematic siege. To this end, against the northern part of the city wall, the Romans began to build a rampart of wood, earth and stone, which was to allow them to fight at the same level as the besieged. The Roman soldiers working on the rampart used shields made of willow twigs to protect themselves from the arrows fired by the defenders of the walls. Throwing machines were set up around the city, continuously raining clouds of arrows and darts on the walls. Then the besieged in small groups began to make sorties, destroying the wicker shields and attacking the soldiers who were hiding behind them. To protect against raids, the Romans built a solid fence along the city walls. Now the raids were much less frequent. Meanwhile, work continued on the rampart, and it soon rose flush with the teeth of the walls. Then, on Joseph's advice, the Jews at night built up the city wall to a height of 9 meters. To protect themselves during the work from the hail of enemy arrows and stones, they made a cover of wet skins. Finally, the rampart came so close to the walls that the Romans were able to launch a battering ram. Its blows loosened the wall so that it was bound to collapse. Then the Jews made another sortie, during which they managed to set fire to the siege machines and destroy part of the rampart. In this battle, Vespasian, who had carelessly approached the walls, was wounded in the foot by an arrow. When the wall began to succumb to the blows of the ram, the Roman army prepared to march to the assault. As soon as the wooden bridges were thrown over the walls, the besiegers themselves rushed to meet the danger. Both sides showed marvels of bravery in the battle. In the end, the Romans succeeded in pushing their opponents back, but at this critical moment Josephus ordered boiling oil to be poured on them from above. In addition, The Jews poured a decoction of Greek hay on the assault bridges, which made their planks slippery, and the soldiers began to fall down from them. By evening, Vespasian was forced to end the battle. The siege of Iotapata lasted 47 days. The fate of the city was decided by treachery. On the advice of a defector who pointed out to the Romans a weak spot in the defense, at dawn a small detachment climbed to a weakly guarded section of the city wall. The sentries, tired from the night's vigil, were asleep. The soldiers who climbed the wall opened access to the rest of the army, and soon the entire city was in their hands. The Romans, exasperated by the stubborn defense, massacred its defenders. Only 1,200 women and children, sold into slavery, survived, and the rest of the inhabitants were killed. The fate of Joseph ben Mattathias was different. Together with 40 other Jews, he managed to escape and hide in an underground cistern. Here he hid for 2 days, after which the Romans discovered the hiding place. Vespasian, who wanted to capture the enemy commander alive, sent a familiar officer to him, who offered terms of surrender. The men surrounding Josephus wished to share the fate of their fallen comrades, and by lot, one by one, all killed themselves. Joseph was left alone with the last of them whom he had persuaded to surrender. He spent a year in chains, then his conditions were softened. From a prisoner he became a friend of the Romans, the official historiographer of the Jewish revolt, and a witness to the capture of Jerusalem and the death of his people. We know the history of this confrontation from his work, The Jewish War. From Iotapata the Roman army returned to Caesarea and rested for 20 days. Then Vespasian marched to Scythopolis, and from there to Tiberias. In the city at this time there was a conflict between the supporters of the Romans and the rebels, led by Jesus ben Saphia. With the approach of the Roman army, the latter left the city and went to Taricheae, located on the shore of Lake Gennesaret. Its defenders intended to fight the Romans simultaneously on land and on water. Vespasian threw 1,000 horsemen, led by Titus, against the main forces of the Jews, who came out of the gates of the city. Roman cavalry easily dispersed lightly armed rebels, and on the shoulders of fleeing broke into the city. The soldiers cordoned off the gates of the city, killing anyone who tried to escape. The next day the Romans built rafts and put archers on them. Approaching the huddled in the middle of the lake shuttles of the Jews, the Romans, themselves clad in armor, or without any danger to themselves, shot them with bows or pierced their sides and drowned. Those who found themselves in the water were stabbed with spears. Those who swam to the shore were waiting for the soldiers who were there. In a few days the waters of the lake threw ashore so many dead bodies that it seemed as if even the air was contaminated with a terrible stench. The fate of the captured was hardly better. The old, weak and sick were immediately killed by the soldiers. The strongest were sent to Greece to work in the quarries. The rest were sold into slavery. After the fall of Taricheae, at the disposal of the rebels remained only a strong fortress Gamala, which was unsuccessfully besieged by the troops of Agrippa. The Roman siege of Gamala lasted for a month, during which time separate units operated against other rebel centers in Galilee. Placidus and his horsemen captured Mount Tabor, on the summit of which a large number of people had gathered. By a feigned retreat, Placidus lured the Jews to the plain, where they were surrounded and cut down by Roman cavalry. After the water supply on the mountain ran out, the people still remaining there were also forced to surrender. Titus with 1,000 horsemen captured Gishala. At the head of the city's defenses was John ben Levi, who engaged in negotiations with the Roman commander on the terms of surrender. After giving himself 2 days to think, John waited until nightfall and fled with his men from the city. In the morning the inhabitants who remained in Gishela opened the gates to Titus. The horsemen sent in pursuit of the fugitives caught up with them and killed many of them, while the women and children were captured and taken back to the city. John and the few men he had with him managed to escape to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Vespasian laid siege to Gamala. This city was a natural fortress perched on the slope of the Golan Heights. Huge crowds of refugees had gathered there, expecting to find a safe haven. The defense was led by the zealous zealots Joseph and Hares. Gamala was well prepared for battle, but since it was late September, and the blockade was not yielding results, Vespasian gave orders to prepare for an assault. The Romans set up throwing machines and subjected the city to a fierce bombardment. Despite the fierce resistance of the besieged, the Romans erected siege mounds, then mounted battering rams on them and broke through the wall in 3 places. Through the gaps they invaded the lower part of the city, and as a result of a stubborn battle they pushed the Jews into the upper part of the city. Here the onslaught of the attackers waned, and as the defenders of the city continued to resist bravely, they finally succeeded in putting the Romans to flight. Taking cover from the clouds of arrows and darts flying at them from above, the Roman soldiers began to retreat. Some of them climbed onto the roofs of houses, which began to collapse under their weight. Many Roman soldiers died under the rubble. Vespasian, who took a personal part in the storming of the city, was in the upper part of it cut off from his own. Showing remarkable courage, the soldiers covered their commander with shields and began to step-by-step retreat back, while repulsing enemy attacks from the front. Through discipline and endurance, they all managed to make it back alive. The brutal defeat demoralized the Roman army and an immediate continuation of the assault was out of the question. Instead, the Romans continued the siege. At dawn on October 22, 3 Roman soldiers broke out with levers several large stones at the base of the northern tower, which led to its collapse. Panic immediately broke out among the defenders of the city. The sentries abandoned their posts, and people rushed in droves to the upper part of the city. In the general turmoil, the commander of the defense of the city Joseph died in a fight at the wall. The Romans, who had learned the previous lesson well, did not enter the city until the next day. Titus, with 200 of his selected soldiers, stealthily entered the city at dawn through the breach and took the Jews by surprise. While the defenders were trying to figure out what was going on, Vespasian brought the main forces of the army into the city. The Roman soldiers, out of revenge for their dead, carried out a brutal massacre in the streets. Of the 9,000 inhabitants, only 2 women survived and escaped the fury of the victors.